Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CNAS special event on spyware and security. Thank you to those who are attending in person, and a big thank you to our online audience for tuning in today. My name is Alexandra Seymour, and I'm an Associate Fellow with the Technology and National Security Program here at the Center for a New American Security. Today, we're going to unpack the national security concerns that stem from foreign commercial spyware tools, which are increasingly being used by authoritarian nations that seek to advance digital authoritarianism within and across borders. We have an hour and a half today to discuss this important topic, and we're very fortunate to be joined by Congressman Jim Himes for the entire duration of this discussion. We'll kick off with a fireside chat before welcoming our other guests, Steve Feldstein, who is here from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Chris Porter from Google Cloud, and they'll join us for the panel discussion portion of the session. Before I introduce Congressman Himes, I just want to remind everyone tuning in online that you can ask questions in the chat box directly at cnas.org/live, or you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022. But please make sure to identify yourself if you are sending in any questions, because we will not be accepting any that are submitted anonymously. And for those in the room, I'll make sure to save some time at the end of each portion of the discussion so that you have an opportunity to ask questions as well. Additionally, please note that there will be a brief pause in the middle of our conversation today after our fireside chat, just so that we can transition the stage and make sure that Steve and Chris are able to get onto the stage. So with that, I am delighted to introduce and to welcome Congressman Jim Himes. Congressman Himes represents Connecticut's 4th District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he is currently serving his 7th term. He serves as the chair of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth, and the National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy Subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee. Prior to his service in Congress, Congressman Himes ran the New York City branch of the Enterprise Community Partners, which is a nonprofit focused on addressing urban poverty, as well as held several local level positions. He began his professional career at Goldman Sachs, where he worked his way up to vice president over the course of a 12-year career. Congressman, thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to kick off because you have really been a leader on this topic in particular. And in September, you and several members of Congress submitted a letter to Secretary Blinken and to Secretary Raimondo asking them, I'll quote, to provide specific details as to the steps the state and commerce departments are taking, not only to protect U.S. citizens and residents, but also to hold accountable companies that proliferate this malicious weapon and the foreign governments that are misusing it. So can you, for those of us who are unfamiliar in the audience, can you outline what spurred this letter and what some of the biggest national security concerns that you see with foreign commercial spyware?
Sure. And again, thanks to CNAS and to all of you for being here and for focusing on this important topic. So the context here is, it wasn't in my introduction, but I've been, 10 years now, I guess, on the Intelligence Committee. And the Intelligence Committee had held a rare open hearing on the subject of spyware and the threat posed by that technology. It's obviously something that had been simmering below the surface. The hearing really highlighted, in particular, there were a number of witnesses, but there was one in particular, Karine Kanimba, whose father, well-known dissident in Rwanda, was a victim of spyware that allowed an authoritarian government to get into his device and ultimately was lured back to the country and remains in jail today. And when you hear that story, she was a particularly compelling witness, but when you hear that story, you realize that that this is really dangerous stuff, and it's a technology. It's in that category of technologies that are really frightening because they provide, just to give you one little slice of it, they provide, for lack of a better way of describing it, sort of superpower surveillance capability to anybody who purchases the technology. And I think most people are aware of this, but I mean, it is scary stuff. It allows for no-click, basically taking control of your device. Even when that device is off, we believe that there are some technologies that can take control of the camera, that can control all of the audio capabilities. And so now simply by buying a license, and it's more complicated than that, though, you now can conduct surveillance of anyone. It has subsequently transpired that a number of U.S. government employees, diplomats, and others were found to have this spyware on their phones in multiple countries, probably perpetrated by multiple countries. And so the point of that hearing was really to focus attention on that problem. The solution, of course, is a really complicated combination of technology companies doing what technology companies do, trying to patch vulnerabilities in the technology, and the U.S. government, of course, being really thoughtful about how to work with fellow democracies to, if you will, sanction, I don't use that as a term of art, but to come up with the right sets of carrots and sticks to keep governments from using this technology, maybe period, but certainly in ways that are inconsistent with our values. And I say maybe period because this opens up a whole other conversation about that always exists with technology, which is, hey, do we want to use it too, and under what circumstances? And if we use it, does that open the door to authoritarian regime? So you get into that whole mess. So that's the background, and that set off, of course, a letter to the administration, which shockingly and probably coincidentally not, I got an answer to about an hour ago from the administration on how they're approaching this this challenge.
Yeah. Just bouncing off of that, is there anything that you're able to share from that off the bat?
Yeah. So I haven't had a chance to absorb it in detail, but we basically asked the administration, what are you doing about this? They responded with a couple of things that we already knew. Commerce placing a number of companies that, and they do this more broadly for the surveillance technology ecosystem, but placing a number of companies onto the entity list, which of course prohibits U.S. companies from doing business with those companies. Interestingly enough, I won't go through the whole letter, but the administration really made an effort at the Summit for Democracy to work with fellow democracies around a framework, a voluntary framework for how we might use this stuff and how we might address more authoritarian non-democracies from using it. And then interestingly, this caught my attention, the administration is preparing an executive order to prohibit U.S. government operational use of commercial spyware. And this is where it gets interesting, that poses counterintelligence or security risks to the United States or risks being used improperly. Any lawyers in the room are now, improperly. How is that defined? But anyway, that was their response, and I've had enough communications with them to know that they're taking this pretty seriously for all the obvious reasons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think to dig into one other thing that was in the letter that you sent as well, and you mentioned you, of course, are on the Intelligence Committee, but you mentioned in that letter that there was a new provision proposed within the FY 2023 Intelligence Authorization Act. And for those who might not be familiar with what you outlined there, can you talk about what that bill included and maybe some of the challenges that you think it will address?
Yeah, so the current version of the Intelligence Authorization Act has a number of provisions that we're hoping to get passed. I'm in a little bit of a grumpy mood because I think the most valuable provision would give the president the discretionary authority to sanction persons or entities who trade in spyware or contribute to the construction or deployment of spyware. The reason I say I'm in a little bit of a grumpy mood is that we're caught up in a classic sort of congressional furball over jurisdiction on this because the IAA is likely to get put into the National Defense Authorization Act, and in order to do that, you need four corners approval, that is to say Republican, Democrat, House, and Senate, and there's jurisdictional issues, even though it's an obvious intelligence, national security thing. Treasury is involved in sanctions, and so now the banking. Anyway, I don't want to go on because it'll just make me angry, more angry than I am. But anyway, that's the key provision, and that would obviously be a really positive development. Just the listing of a number of companies onto the entity list completely changed the weather around the world around this. So if the Congress could get its act together and speak with one voice and say, Mr. President, you've got the authority to do this, that would be a big step forward. But like I said, congressional stuff being congressional stuff, I don't know that we'll get it done this go around.
Yeah, actually, that segues very nicely into the next question that I wanted to ask you. Just given that you've elevated this issue within Congress and you've mentioned that the administration is taking this seriously, as demonstrated by the letter that you just shared, but how have you seen throughout your time in Congress too, how their approach to or their awareness of this issue has evolved throughout the time that you've been in office?
You know, if you think of the 535 members of the Congress and the mean age of that group of people, this is not 535 people who are at the cutting edge of technological innovation and developments, and I've got colleagues who I think still are struggling with text and email. So it's not necessarily an institution that is going to be at the cutting edge of technological developments. The good news is that there are subsets of the Congress that are very, very focused and very interested in this. And then when you hear, we're people, right? When you hear stories like Kareen's stories, when you start to think about the implications as a member of Congress, for example, of who might take control of that phone and what the implications of that might be, you don't need to be a technological expert to say, hey, you know, I'm gonna be interested in this and I'm gonna promote it. And you don't necessarily need to be a technologist to say I'm gonna, you know, steer my subcommittee in that direction. And that's happening. As you asked the question, weird analogy, but it's a little like, you know, because it's so in the headlines, crypto assets and cryptocurrencies, right? I mean, 5 years ago, there wasn't a member of Congress who would have recognized what a crypto asset was. 5 years ago, that would have been true of spyware, but because it's so in the news, the Congress is rapidly coming up to speed.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly something we see across a lot of technology areas, is so many of them pop up into the news cycle and people are hearing about them for the first time, but it does kind of create that sense of urgency to do something about it. So I guess going off of that too, as you move into your next term in Congress, what are some of the priorities that you have on this topic? And perhaps as a follow-up to that as well, some of the areas, since this has been elevated, of areas where you might see opportunities to work across the aisle and to find bipartisan legislation, and maybe areas of contention as well, some of the points that you think will be harder to message.
Yeah, I mean, the good news, first the context, right? The whole topic of spyware and to some extent national security in general doesn't fall into the polarized maw of partisan crazy. And so I think we've got a real opportunity to make progress on this issue. I don't know why I keep drawing the analogy, but I would say the same thing about crypto assets. You know, it just doesn't fit neatly into the left-right divide. And so I do think that we've got a real opportunity. The likely next areas where we should, I don't know if we're necessarily going to legislate, but be really thoughtful. Number one is how does the government interact with the private sector? It's a really interesting question, right? It's very sensitive because for obvious reasons, you know, if the technology companies are spending a lot of time with the experts on this topic at places like Fort Meade, Maryland, NSA, that raises certain perceptual issues, but that's a very robust flow, obviously, of know-how, of technological know-how. So there's all kinds of things to be worked out, and we've done this before in the cybersecurity realm of what precisely the relationship should be between the government and the private sector, if any. And then there's an interesting conversation to be had. I was having it with a White House person just the other day. You know, the classic question raised by tools. Tools are tools, technology or technology. I was really interested, and I read that portion of the letter to you for a reason, a prohibition on the operational use. But, you know, we've been struggling with the going dark problem for a very long time, right? The fact that there's now encrypted technology, which from a privacy standpoint is wonderful, but from the standpoint of hiding human trafficking or drug dealing or terrorist activity is a real problem for law enforcement. So now we get into that classic conversation. Really? Do we really not want to have access to... Now, for us, it's a little easier. For us, I mean the United States, it's a little easier conversation because, again, we have sort of superpower technological capabilities. But we're not always the leader on technology, and maybe we want the FBI to have the option to be a leader on technology that could help stop. So it's the classic argument, but we need to make a little bit of progress in terms of thinking about if you are going to use a tool like this stuff, let's just say for law enforcement purposes, you better build the Fourth Amendment protections around the use of that, which we have not really in any meaningful way begun to do.
Yeah, So actually, to follow up, we'll probably pose this again in the panel discussion, because I think it would be interesting to also hear Steve and Chris's perspectives on this as well. But on that note of maybe some of the legitimate uses of these types of technologies, so would you say that we really need to put those frameworks in place and to have that legal framework and those internationally agreed upon standards to be able to use it? Or do you see any legitimate uses off the bat?
I mean, the last question is an easy one. Yes, if a tool is valuable in stopping terrorism or stopping child trafficking, I want to use that tool. But of course, I want to use that tool consistent with the legality laid out in the Constitution, Fourth Amendment in particular, and also just more broadly speaking, consistent with our values. Now, that instantly opens up internationally. If you say that we're going to use these tools in certain instances, Russia will say, yeah, so will we, and China will, so it instantly creates a little bit of static internationally. But of course we want to use these tools, technology, but one of the traditional critical aspects of Fourth Amendment protections is that the government detail with great specificity what it is they are after and where it is. That's a long tradition of that. And if in fact a technology is essentially all-encompassing, that's very hard to do. In other words, if the spyware gives you access to the drug dealer's telephone and you want to get the emails, but you're not entitled to get the photographs and the contacts, it gets technologically tricky. This is but by the way, this is not a totally new concept. 702 FISA collection, right? A critical tool for intelligence collection is also very broad-based. It's very hard to get targeted emails without knowing who is on the other side, the recipient or the sender of that email. If that sender or that recipient is a U.S. person, that creates a whole bunch of constitutional issues. So it's not a brand new issue, but it's one that we haven't really sort of worked through yet.
Yes, absolutely. Pivoting a little bit, and we were talking about different technologies too that continue to come up in conversations on the Hill. So there are other related discussions about comprehensive data privacy, lots of discussions about artificial intelligence and other technology areas that are related to this topic. But to what extent do you think that those debates can feed into the discussions that we're having here about commercial spyware and those ongoing conversations?
Yeah.
I know different issues too, and lots to unpack there as well. But I am curious, given especially with these technologies, AI-powered, leaning on data, and some of those as the concerns that we have.
Yeah, no, I chuckle because a really thoughtful answer to the question takes you sort of out of the realm of policy and into the realm of evolutionary biology and philosophy. I mean, I could name for you 3 technologies. Biosynthesis, right? Where right now in Boston, somebody's like making a new animal, literally. Artificial intelligence, where somebody is pretty close to figuring out how to create a human mind. Quantum computing, which could render all encryption useless. These are technologies that have evolved more rapidly than our brain's ability to think about the values and ethics of their use. Not unprecedented, nuclear weapons being the obvious analogy to, but anyway, it's a really scary thing. And so you get into this dynamic where you say, okay, well, we've got to get the ethicists together. We've got to get, in a democratic society, everybody with a stake in this to kind of come up with ethical principles for ethical use. And yes, we should do that, but then you're of course left with the inevitability that we're one of the societies that would take that seriously, but in other societies, they're not going to do that. And so how do we think about that? And it's pretty scary because, some of these technologies, including the ones that I mentioned, are, what's the right word? I was going to say existential. It's an overused word, but, could radically alter the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The ethical questions are certainly tricky and ones that we're working both internally and with our allies and partners to address. I have a question from the audience online, actually, and he mentioned cryptocurrency in this, which I guess catching on to some of the things you were saying. So this is from Jaewoo. He says that North Korea is well known for using ransomware, and there have been reports that it's stealing cryptocurrency and using it for missile tests. Can you speak to your perspective of North Korea when it comes to foreign commercial spyware, to the extent that you can?
Yeah, ransomware, of course, is a close cousin to spyware, and it's one that I think is much more broadly known. Certainly, after colonial pipelines, there weren't that many people around who weren't aware of the risks of malware. It's with respect to North Korea, if you can't make money being a normal partner in the commercial intercourse of nations, you're going to look for things like malware and whatever, tasking your diplomats to make money for you abroad. So not surprising, but it is a close cousin, and it is really scary in the context of North Korea, because again, this is a technology spyware which could give I keep using the rather awkward term, superpower capabilities to countries that are not only not superpowers, but don't have the, necessarily the incentives, even if they don't have the values, the incentives to behave in the international arena. The good news is today, and one thing you can be sure of is that technology propagates, but today, though it's not a pretty situation, the companies out there have some controls. NSO, probably the biggest and most well-known name in the space, said they apparently had a relationship with the Israeli sovereign government to, approve licenses. So it does feel like now there is some visibility into a process to get those licenses, but you can count on that. Technology propagates, right? So you can count on at least that check, however imperfect it may be, ultimately going away.
Yeah. Actually, bouncing off of that, related to NSO Group, so FBI Director Wray, he had stated in March that the FBI had bought a limited license, something you had mentioned in your opening remarks, for Pegasus, just for testing and evaluation purposes. But just a couple of days ago, the New York Times had reported the FBI had actually developed a plan to deploy NSO hacking tools. I'm just curious to hear your reaction to that reporting, and anything that you might have to say on that.
Yeah, this is a classic. Having done oversight of the intelligence community for a very long time, there's less to the story there than meets the eye. I think the FBI was doing exactly what we would hope the FBI would do, which was, purchase a license, really understand the equipment. I want them to do that, and then I think they were thinking about operational deployment. And my understanding is that they even had a mock argument in favor of operational deployment. That's very different than operationally deploying it, right? That it goes through a lengthy process. So I do think in that particular story there was less than meets the eye. I suppose you could parse Director Wray's words and I'm supposed to be very jealous of Congress's prerogative. You could parse his words to see if he was perfectly honest in his. My guess is that FBI did what it should do, and a news story ensued. By the way, if they had deployed it operationally, I would be much more interested in the story. But at the end of the day, they didn't, and there's an ongoing conversation, of course, of whether they should and under what circumstances, and sort of alluded to in that letter.
Yes. So I guess just to follow up on that, so you would see that there is a role, at least in the research and development context, for these types of technologies, because they had claimed testing and evaluation, they had developed the plan, but ultimately understanding it in the research and development context is something that you think is okay.
Well, not only okay, essential. I don't want any technology out there that our people don't understand, because it will propagate, and I want our people to understand that technology. So from an R&D standpoint, absolutely. In fact, it would be negligent, in my opinion, were they not to explore and understand technology that could be turned against Americans, as it has been. Obviously, the operational deployment thing is a whole other conversation. But again, did they have a unit that was thinking about why and how you would make an argument to deploy? I hope so. I just hope that they also had a unit thinking about the counter arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple of minutes left just for this portion of the session. I wanted to see, we're going to do Q&A for both portions, but if anyone has any questions just for the Congressman, would be happy to take them from the in-person audience now. And for those also online, remember you can submit your questions cnas.org/live or on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022. In-person audience. Yes, ma'am. And just wait one moment. We're going to have a mic come to you just so that the audience online can hear.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Katrina Manson from Bloomberg News. I was interested by your comments, obviously, about US diplomats having been spied on in the past. Can you give us your update of where you think that problem is today? Has state dealt with it? Has it got worse? And of course, I'm mindful of the reports of Liz Truss's phone when she was UK Foreign Secretary, that her personal phone, she was doing diplomatic dealings on it through WhatsApp. Do you ever question what US officials are doing, and of course her counterpart in the US, Secretary Blinken, with his phone?
Yeah. I can't give you a lot more on the U.S. diplomats. As you might imagine, there's a pretty substantial investigation underway, but multiple U.S. diplomats were targeted in multiple locations. Beyond that, I can't go beyond that. And then, of course, you raise a really, we've alluded to this conversation, and of course, this really blew up in the early parts of the Obama administration when it turned out that I guess there were reports that I can't remember, thinking 10 years back now, but there were reports, of course, that U.S. intelligence had collected from some of the devices of our allies behind closed doors everywhere for multiple reasons. And so this is a problem to be managed. And I think, each relationship is somewhat different. I do think that, in my own personal opinion, I think that collecting on our NATO allies was probably a really bad idea. I think that was probably what the president at the time felt. But I do think it's really worthwhile not just having these conversations inside Washington, D.C., but having these conversations in the open with our, you can pick your venue, Five Eyes, NATO, groups of democracies, G20, so that we're at least creating some understanding of what other people may think. But we're not going to stop collecting. We're just going to try to manage that in a way that the costs and benefits make sense.
Other audience questions? Yes, right there you go. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Jeff Zeberline from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Thank you for being here. If I have my Connecticut geography right, I think your district is home to one of the most advanced semiconductor companies, ASML. They have a location there, and they also have locations in Taiwan. Since we are talking about kind of advanced technology, I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit on some of the recent developments, both from the executive and legislative branches about kind of semiconductor decoupling and how that plays, and how what kind of steps we should or should not be taking to kind of ensure our own U.S. interests in that regard.
Yeah, let me give a brief answer because it's a little bit off topic of what we're talking about here, but it's a really important question. Look, I think that two really good things have happened. Number one, if it can be said to be any benefit coming out of the last 2 years, because it was not 2 years with much benefit, it was the awareness of the fragility of supply chains. And the old consensus that it didn't matter where we did stuff, whether it was masks or advanced semiconductors, that consensus is gone. So now we're having this conversation about, onshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring. It's a good conversation to have. I also think that it is, it can lead to a false sense of security. So we passed the CHIPS Act and on to the next thing. It will be a generation before there is not profound vulnerability to the semiconductor supply chain in East Asia. And it's not just Taiwan, it's Korea and China itself. And so I think we took some good steps, but I think that the perceived benefit was maybe exaggerated relative to the still profound interconnectedness of these supply chains. So the piece of it that we need to not forget, and I feel this every single day in Washington, which is there may at some point be a good reason for a kinetic military thing in Asia. I certainly hope not, but we better really be conscious of what it is that we're talking about here, and not just we, but the Chinese. You could run the CHIPS Act out for 30 years, and a war in Taiwan would still devastate apocalyptically the global economy. So we just need to be conscious of the fact that we didn't fix this problem with the CHIPS Act. We may have made it better, but we did not fix this problem. We're still interconnected in a way that would make the economic dislocation associated with the pandemic look like child's play, were there to be a massive disruption in East Asia.
We probably have time for one more audience question in this session. I think you had your hand up first, and we will have more Q&A.
Matt Scott. I lead the intelligence division for a U.S. contractor. My question to you, Congressman, and thank you, by the way, for your work on this issue, is spyware is probably just one example of an intelligence capability that was formerly restricted to nation states. How, and as a longtime member of HIPC, how does the U.S. intelligence community maintain its decision advantage, when its capabilities are increasingly available to actors who aren't nation states?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's an obvious but unsatisfying answer, which is that we continue to invest in the people and the education and the capability that makes sure that those who are at the cutting edge of technological innovation are doing it in the service of U.S. national security. That's what we've always done. We got to keep doing it. It's a little bit of an unsatisfying answer because you'd like to believe that maybe there's a way that sort of solves the problem, but there's not. And my own intuition is that we'll do all sorts of work around Fourth Amendment protections on the use of this, and we'll get together with our fellow democracies and do. The real answer here is going to be what the real answer always is, which is the technology companies are going to figure out how to close the doors that are open today, and they'll do that. They will do that, and then of course you're going to have the next NSO figure out how to find new doors. And so I just think that's a dynamic that exists. And I don't believe that there's any particular tectonic change that will bring it to an end. So we do need to make sure that we are at the cutting edge of technologies. I went through that whole San Bernardino Apple thing, where Apple refused to open up the phone, and I had lots of conversations with Apple executives. In the end, I sort of sympathized with them, which is, please don't make us do it, because if you make us do it, the Chinese will make us do it. And by the way, if you want us to give access to you, other people will. So there was that whole argument. So anyway, unsatisfying though it may be, I think the technology companies need to do what they're good at doing, which is closing the vulnerabilities. And the folks up at NSA and FBI and Secret Service and everything need to stay at the cutting edge in order to try to collect in the ways that we don't talk a lot about, but which we will continue collecting.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Congressman. As I mentioned, we're just going to take a very brief pause. So for our online audience, please make sure that you stay with us. We're just going to quickly transition the stage and bring up our other panelists for the next part of our discussion. So thank you all. Just one moment. back, everyone. As a reminder, you can submit your questions through the chat box at cnas.org/live, or you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022. And for our in-person audience, thank you for bearing with us as well as we went through the transition. We are very delighted to now have a full panel on stage joining Congressman Himes and I. And I would like to introduce them to you. So first we have Steve Feldstein. He's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on issues of democracy and technology, human rights, and U.S. foreign policy. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau at the U.S. Department of State, as well as held positions on the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and in the U.S. Agency for International Development. And then we also have Christopher Porter joining us. He is the head of threat intelligence at Google Cloud and a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, where he focuses on cyber diplomacy and AI as a security issue. He previously served as the National Intelligence Officer for Cyber, leading the U.S. intelligence community's analysis of foreign cyber threats and threats to U.S. elections. He also previously worked at FireEye as Chief Technology Officer for Global Cybersecurity Policy and was the company's Chief Intelligence Specialist. So thank you both for being here as well, and thank you again, Congressman Himes. So actually, in our preceding conversation actually teed up very well some of the topics that I wanted to discuss with all of you on the stage, because I know you all bring different backgrounds from research, from the private sector, from serving in different parts of the government. So I wanted to start off first by talking about allies and partners and working together. So I think I'm going to go to you first, Christopher, to answer this question. But what are some of the most promising areas that you might think we might be able to collaborate with allies and partners? Perhaps thinking about this from a private sector lens in terms of how we're developing and using technologies.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invitation today and for the question. I think it's an important one. What the United States and its allies share in common is rule of law, protection of individual privacy, a commitment to defending human dignity. I think the answer to your question is rooted in the nature of the problem. In your letter, Congressman, to those departments, you described it as a weapon. That's a common way of describing cyber tools, but I think it really applies in this case. These aren't police tools that are being abused. These are electronic warfare weapons that incidentally have a law enforcement, potential application. So we should think about them that way. I don't think we're going to, as the West, as a family of nations, committed to freedom, I don't think we're going to outcompete China, for example, if the vector that we're trying to compete on is who can build the best Orwellian spying machine that targets individuals, right? Mm-hmm. So these are weapons. This is not the first time we've had this kind of problem, within NATO or among our friends. But I think it starts with, moral clarity about what we're talking about. You don't trust a sort of campfire to just burn itself out at night. You need some people who actively watch it. It doesn't police itself. These tools are going to be very similar. So I say conceptually, first off, we need to work with our allies to think about these as weapons like any other, only they're weapons that can be deployed at massive scale, very intimately into our lives. What are we committed to? What kind of values do we want to defend? When will we use them? How do we protect rule of law? It's not just about preventing the export of the tools, but as the orders make clear, perhaps foregoing the use ourselves. I'm much more worried about abuse by the MSS or the FSB targeting Americans than I am about complicating our own law enforcement job. Both are important, but we're here at a national security event, and I think it's still a net positive for national security if we both minimize the use of these tools, working with our partners, share intelligence with them on threats that we discover. Google has a long history in this area. We've caught a number of vendors since 2017. Every few years we catch them developing exploits against Android or against Apple's systems, and we expose that publicly. So greater sharing of intelligence on threats with our allies, but also a sense of what kind of government do we want to live in, because these weapons fundamentally restructure in a way that we haven't dealt with since the invention of the telegram, what the relationship is between a government and the governed. So now you've got countries that are essentially doing domestic security work, but outside their borders. And we talk about Russia and China, and we're very concerned about peer competitors doing this and infringing on constitutional rights in the United States. But as you pointed out earlier, Congressman, I think very well, it provides power to a lot of other actors as well. One of the original cases Citizen Lab discovered was targeting of, I believe, Ethiopian dissidents here in Washington, D.C., running a sort of expatriate newspaper. The fact that they, operated down the street from FBI headquarters didn't protect their constitutional rights from this other government trying to silence their voice. So I would just say a commitment to shared values, sharing intelligence, and since I work at Google, I have to say I think it's true. A lot of the solution, yes, is policy. A lot of it is also letting engineers do their jobs, right? Letting us build secure products. You pointed to the San Bernardino case, but there's many other cases. It's going to be a net positive both for your personal privacy and human dignity, but also for national security if you let engineers build the most secure products possible and not force them to introduce more doors to open. I think that's obviously a technical positive. So.
Yeah, no, thank you, Christopher. Congressman Himes, the same question for you, but curious from the government-to-government engagement perspective with allies and partners, and perhaps in looking at how we're setting standards, what you think that cooperation should look like.
Yeah, I think that kind of conversation, we were sort of alluding it from the young woman who asked the question. The conversation is really important for at least two reasons. Number one, to understand how our allies think about, even the values. I mean, it's a mistake to say that, that the values of the United States are precisely the same as the values of the UK, right? UK doesn't have a First Amendment, so we differ a little bit in terms of these things. Germany has its own tradition for historical reasons of how they think about surveillance, which is very different than the way we think about it. Maybe not very different, but different than the way we think about it. So it's always worth having those conversations so that we aren't surprised by each other, and so that we are not undertaking activities that would damage the alliances, and so that we, as democracies with maybe not perfectly coincident values, but with related values, send a signal to the rest of the world that we care about this stuff, that if you do try to, surveil U.S. persons, and an Ethiopian working in Washington, D.C. is a U.S. person, legally speaking, that there will be consequences. So I think these conversations, even if they don't necessarily solve the problem, are really important.
Steve, do you have anything else to add on any of this?
Yeah, I think we've opened up a pretty robust discussion, and there's a lot of things that are worth talking about. I would put a fine line on one issue, which is that I think there's a difference between the private sector, between commercial vendors being able to proliferate these tools in a way that's unregulated, that is prone to abuse, versus having in-house capabilities that are run by intelligence agencies and departments around the world, hopefully in democracies where there's the rule of law, but sometimes not, where at least you are able to have some degree of coherence and some degree of accountability within that process, whether it's diplomatically or within the countries themselves. But when you have rogue operators like NSO Group, Cytrox, Virin Systems, Cellebrite, name your vendor, and let's also be honest about them. They are based oftentimes in democracies. NSO Group was incorporated and built from in Israel, who's a partner and ally, and so I think the lines get very complicated when it comes to the private sector side, and that's where I think from the human rights community and from many others, there's a lot of concern about what this proliferation means.
Yeah, no, thank you, Steve. I actually want to stay with you on that point too, because I think the human rights aspect is really important for this conversation. And I know we're having a national security discussion, but this is, of course, something that we need to keep forefront as well. And I know you've done a lot of work on this too, so also want to be able to hear some of your expertise about some of the trends that you've seen growing with the use of commercial technologies as relates to further surveillance state efforts and otherwise, if you would be able to share maybe some of the trends you've seen.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of the things that we know is that the number of countries around the world that are taking advantage of these tools is increasing quite a bit. I think it's something like at least 82 countries around the world. There's documentation that they're using any combination of different types of spyware. Again, whether it's zero-click, whether it's other types of malware that's around. And so, one of the things we have to recognize is that it's growing. I'm not sure there's a way to put the cat in the bag, in the sense that at this point, we're seeing kind of a democratization of spyware, and that even if you were to close down the biggest operators, if you were to put more entities like NSO Group on an entity list, and you were to see Europe to do something commensurate, and if Israel were to start cracking down and reducing the licenses, I still think you'd have a problem. I think it would cascade down into more informal hacking groups, and this is already something that we're seeing anyway. And so, in a sense, we are facing a dilemma where this type of technology, the further we get along, the more it's not limited to high-level, sophisticated, revenue-producing commercial spyware firms, let alone in-house capabilities of entities like NSA and so forth. So it is spreading, and I think that's something we have to think about. Nonetheless, I do think that regulations and pushback can have an effect, and I will look at the entity list as a really great example of what a concerted act by the U.S. government, despite diplomatic pressure by Israel, has done to really hamper the ability of NSO Group to operate as a profit-making entity going forward. And I think we could see more of that. We could see more of that from our democratic allies, such as in the European Union, which doesn't have a similar type of list yet. But I think that even the reputational and symbolic effect of putting companies like that out there and saying, "Look, this is the line," I think that can have a virtuous effect, even if it doesn't solve the overall problem.
Yeah. Now, actually, a related question, going to you first, Congressman Himes. Related around this messaging, and I think that was a really good example that you just offered, Steve, of talking about the entity list and even just the messaging of that and drawing a line between democratic versus maybe more of an authoritarian use. So my question for you, Congressman Himes, is around the messaging. How effective do you think that our messaging is right now around democratic versus authoritarian use of these types of technologies? And what are some of the things that you think the public still needs to better understand to wrap their heads around this issue?
It's a really interesting question. It's an interesting question because I think as far as what people think of the U.S. government's position on this stuff is anything but constant. I joined the Intelligence Committee, and 3 weeks later, Edward Snowden did his thing, and so there was this massive backlash, and all of a sudden, everybody was saying, "Oh my God, the United States has been doing this or that," and I think that we swing back and forth in the perception of our allies, and in particular, and I care most about our allies because Russia and China don't, their opinions of what we're doing matter less than our allies and persuadable non-allies. I mean, we sort of talk about this as though it is simply the U.S., Europe, NATO, and China, Russia, North Korea. The fact is you've got 100+ countries that would care a lot about what we said and did. And so I think it's really hard to answer the question about, are we consistently perceived as 100% dedicated to the preservation not only of our U.S. person's privacy, but of privacy around the globe. I think it really varies depending on a whole bunch of factors. But that's not a reason to ever give credence to the constant whataboutism of our antagonists, right? There is a fundamental difference between U.S. Fourth Amendment sanctioned surveillance and what they do in China, and we can't fall into this notion that they would love to have us fall into no, there's really no difference.
Yeah, no, thank you. Christopher, I'd really like to hear your perspective on this question as well, particularly from the threat perception standpoint too, in terms of how we can think about the threats that are coming from more authoritarian regimes and how we can kind of paint a picture of more of a democratic use.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's just this in the abstract you could have a security versus privacy kind of discussion, but let's talk empirically what actually happens in the real world. At Google, out of the 9 0 days we discovered in 2021, 7 of them were developed by private companies. Again, this isn't a police tool that is somehow being abused or something. It's the other way. And in fact, to some degree, most of the problem, I share Steve's perspective. I have less concern about the U.S. and its allies developing in-house capabilities or having contract, right? That is a reasonable thing for a nation state to do. But when you start allowing the police in an authoritarian state to wiretap us here in America, is that a military act? Is a national security issue? Is that an invasion of my constitutional rights? Well, it's all of those mixed in together. But I think it is important to know that most of the observed problem that is going against users of those systems is coming from these private companies on the high end of the technology. And they're also not usually going after human traffickers and terrorists and things like that. I'm sure that is what the FBI would do with it. I don't really have any particular concerns. Obviously, anything could happen. But in general, as an institution, I don't have any concerns about how they would use the technology. We live in a country with the rule of law. Around the world, most of the actual threat that most human beings face on their phones in particular are going to be people who are political activists, human rights activists, journalists, academics who are researching things that are uncomfortable to whomever. That is the large majority of who is actually targeted with this. So I don't think anybody on this panel thinks that way. But in the abstract, when you read about this in the newspaper, one might be inclined to think, well, I don't know, why shouldn't we give police these powers and encourage these developments? But that's not actually how it's being used. Again, it is mostly being used as a tool of domestic stability enhancement. That's why it's the domestic security services in some of these countries that do it as opposed to the foreign intelligence services. It varies by country, but a lot of the activity is conducted by their equivalent of the FBI. And to prevent protests on their streets, they're targeting journalists in America or whatever. That fundamentally undermines what it means to be let's say an American. That fundamentally undermines what it means to have those constitutional rights if the police in a different state can take that away from me outside of the context of an act of war. So, yeah, I appreciate the question, but just for context, this is mostly used as a tool of transnational repression as part of a domestic governing system. The other applications for traditional foreign intelligence gathering and so forth, that happens too, but mostly with in-house capabilities, or it's more of an edge case. The commercial vendors are not mostly used that way.
Yeah. To follow up on that, Steve, I'm curious to hear from you, given the way that Christopher has just kind of outlined the ways in which the technology is used. For those actors where we feel that they're working in a way, that they use them in a way that's contrary to our democratic values, how do you think that we should be interacting with those types of countries?
Yeah. What's interesting, and first of all, I agree with everything Chris said, so no dispute from this end. But what's interesting is that I think putting it into a kind of an authoritarian democratic camp is a mischaracterization, because what are the two biggest recent scandals that we see in spyware? Greece and Mexico, right? Unless I saw, certainly Greece is within NATO and within the EU and an ally, and so we can't look upon it as just it's those authoritarians, and so therefore if those countries get rule of law, we'll fix the problem, because it's not so simple. And one of the things that's interesting in the Greek situation, as well as in Mexico, is that private sector companies allow for unscrupulous politicians and others to get around formal systems of policing to procure these types of programs in order to then spy on opposition politicians, journalists, and others. And so this again shows you where you have these further openings that commercial vendors provide that otherwise might not be around if that was something that was regulated or even put on a moratorium, or if it was just in-house. And so I just want to emphasize the point that it's not just an authoritarian problem, although certainly it is an authoritarian problem, but that many democracies and weaker democracies also see this happening if you look at the scandals du jour.
Yeah. Congressman Himes, do you have any thoughts on this as well? Kind of the way that Steve has outlined as maybe democratic versus authoritarian use isn't the best way to characterize.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. We sort of started out by saying that one of the challenges with spyware is that you're giving, I keep using the term, superpower capabilities to non-superpowers. The truth is that, China doesn't need to buy NSO stuff. It's true of a number of other countries that have these capabilities. So yes, the action is in those countries that ordinarily wouldn't have the capability to develop these kinds of things. completely agree with. It is my job to provide oversight of the federal government, so so it is important for me to look for those instances where there could be violations inside the United States.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely correct. And again, it's to my point of never allowing ourselves to fall into the whataboutism of our foes who would like us to do so. The threat is much more severe either in the criminal realm, where there's a very powerful financial incentive, or on the part of actors like North Korea or others.
I want to clarify exactly what I'm concerned about, because I agree with the comments that Steve and the Congressman made. The reason the West should consider a very high standard for use of these tools is precisely because you don't want those less than democratic or just less technologically advanced, but currently democratic states or with weaker rule of law. You don't want them to get accustomed to governing through intrusive spying as their method of governing. Because in the long run, not only is that bad for the people they're targeting in the short run, but in the long run, that's going to make the kinds of systems that China is exporting, the Belt and Road driven, yes, tech and economic development, but also heavy on domestic surveillance outside of traditional understandings of Western or American rule of law, that's going to make those kinds of pitches much more attractive. So, I mean, I'm thinking not only short term, that's very important, the individual people, but longer term, by governing that way as democracies, over time, it's going to seem like less of a difference to go with a Chinese model of governance. We're opening ourselves up to long-term influence in terms of our governing structures, because it's not just about a one-time tool. This is a way of thinking about a relationship between the government and the people. So again, not that we can't do it or shouldn't do it, or that I'm concerned about the FBI doing it, but there needs to be, I think, a very high standard for doing it, not because we'll misuse it necessarily, but because it feeds into a global ecosystem, and a lot of our allies and partners. I completely agree with both of your comments. There's concerns there as well, potentially, especially long term.
Yeah, no, excellent points. Thank you, Christopher. I'm going to pivot just a little bit because we have a great question from the audience that came in from online. This question is from Hannah, and I'm going to pose this to you first, Congressman Himes. So recognizing that the new October 7th BIS export control rule is focused on curbing the use of U.S. technology by the PRC to threaten U.S. national security and foreign policy interests, do you see these kinds of controls as potentially useful for mitigating the proliferation of foreign commercial spyware for applications we don't want to see?
They're unquestionably useful. All of the, the whole CFIA structure, the whole, all of these controls are useful. They don't solve the problem. Technology is really, really hard to control. And the longer technology is around, and I'll defer to Chris on this because I sense it, but he sees it. The longer it's around, the more it will propagate. I think that's probably true of any technology. So when you're talking about really cutting edge stuff, reference was made to ASML, the cutting edge, tiny nanometer lithography, you can probably be pretty effective for a period of time. But you can't rely on it. And it's also hard, right? It's not just you can't put this thing in a box and send it to Shenzhen. It's also, wait a minute, who's this investor in this 4-person AI shop in Palo Alto? We don't know who this person is. And so it's really fairly complex. It's important, it's valuable, but it does not solve the problem over time.
Steve and then Christopher, I would like to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think it's slightly apples and oranges in terms of that particular BIS directive and what we're talking about when it comes to spyware. I think with spyware, we're looking at general use technology, and one that, as a congressman rightly says, is proliferating very quickly, and frankly, you won't be able to sort of stop that. You can sort of slow down more advanced aspects. But here, we're talking about very advanced microchips that power the most sophisticated applications, and one where it's the ability to replicate that is not a capacity you can just build overnight. It takes decades of research and cumulative research and development effect to get to that point. So when you cut off that supply, there's no substitute available, and that's for the PRC, let alone the wider sort of array of countries. So I think on that score, we're looking at a very different, frankly, probably a useful tool when it comes to export restrictions. But on spyware, I think steps like the entity list, where you target some of the biggest proliferators in the private sector, the main nodes of distribution, that to me has already shown demonstrable effect and probably should be expanded to other companies as well.
Christopher, any
I'm going to
thoughts?
beg off of any solutions-related questions. As an intelligence analyst, I'm an expert in problems, and I defer to smarter people for solutions. I'll just give you food for thought on conceptually what do I think is happening here. A good way to think about this is about concentration of resources. This is the threat that we're having. You're taking a country or a company's intellectual, technological time, resources, you're putting them against one target. Okay, so almost any individual is going to be outmatched by a very sophisticated, spyware company in terms of the resources that you could possibly deploy to defend yourself. But that changes if, you're backed by the engineers at, Google or another large firm who can put a lot of effort into defending you. Same thing on the nation-state side, right? When Stalin wanted to silence Trotsky, the NKVD had to create, I think, 3 different new human networks into Mexico to go get him and silence him, and they failed multiple times before they finally succeeded. Whereas now a small group of people can silence, voices around the world, while staying in St. Petersburg, right? So the level of resource investment that you have to go after an individual is made lower by this offensive technology, but it's still a matter of scale. Some exceptions, yes, but in general, what you're talking about is how much defensive resources can we put to protect a journalist or an academic and so forth. Export restrictions, I get there's a sense where if you got rid of these companies, it would still proliferate, that's true, and they'd still be a threat to many people. But, in this case, it was the state that did it, but could you target a well-defended target like a senior national government leader if those companies could only get to a certain scale before they became licensed and run by the state? That's the same approach we have with defense contractors, right? You can sell, you can manufacture small arms and so forth, but you can't just build a tank and export it to whoever you want, or a fighter jet or something like that. It's probably a closer model where at some level of scale of offensive capability, the state, not just the U.S., but whatever country, suddenly becomes liable or responsible for what that company is doing. I think that's kind of what's missing in this scenario, but again, borrowing from analogy to the past, that's what is happening to people. They're being targeted with nation-state military quality electronic warfare weapons, but it's being treated as a police matter or a public policy matter as opposed to a national security issue to defend our people. And I think that's a problem. So.
Yeah, I think pivoting a little bit, and we've touched on this a bit about the role of the private sector and the importance. So I want to dig in a little bit more into the public-private sector collaboration aspect and areas where they can work together, and then maybe challenges as well, just given the landscape. So Christopher, I'll stay with you just for a moment, particularly on the question about I know that you're a cyber expert too, and you've looked at a lot of these threats from the intelligence perspective. I'm curious to hear what types of opportunities that you see for collaboration to address some of the threats that we're seeing, given the ways that authoritarian regimes use these types of technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say broadly that this is just my personal view. I feel like the private sector, when it comes to cyber defense, is just inherently going to be better at doing a very good job of defending people at enormous scale, right? At Google, we defend billions of people. If I catch a foreign cyber threat group doing something, very quickly we can turn that around to almost every user on earth of our products and defend them, right? The government, even when working at full speed, inherently slower. You got to get approvals for things. There's legal issues involved. There's declassification and so forth. Okay. But the hardest of the hard problems, really require government effort. So I think the partnership looks a lot like what you see with CISA, which has JCDC. There's a number of other excellent fora for collaboration. It's not, I think when we discuss these things publicly, it's often about everyone coming together and sharing cyber threat intelligence, sharing threats that we know about from spyware companies. Google's committed to continuing to share that with the community whenever we discover those. But I think it's also really, I just want to acknowledge the important role that not just the U.S., but British and other allied and friendly governments play using their unique powers to discover threats, right? Technology that's still in development but hasn't been deployed yet, who the new bad actors are and so forth. They've got an anticipatory ability to get ahead of the problem. I think if you're the president or anyone else responsible for looking at a whole country, what you want is to quickly take those lessons learned and have the private sector engineers apply them to fix the problem at large scale for everyone. That's a very coarse and general description, but we find the partnership with the U.S. and other allied governments, very important to the security we provide to our users already. And I think the private sector is going to be very good at applying the intelligence that Congressman Himes and his community that he's overseeing that they discover. We're going to be the solutions-oriented side of that.
Steve, and then Congressman Himes on this question about public-private collaboration.
Yeah, I would just offer two suggestions. So I think one, broadly speaking, I think we need to figure out as democracies how to clean up our own houses. And I'll give you a quick example on that front. In the EU, despite all the scandals that we've seen when it comes to Pegasus, as it stands, 12 countries are still procuring Pegasus, 15 different agencies spread among them as of today. That to me strikes me as completely egregious. We already know the abuses associated with that company. It already is penalized within the United States, and yet somehow among our democratic allies, that's viewed as an acceptable situation. So cleaning up house, and it's not just within the European Union, it's certainly at home and other places, I think we need to have more coherence when it comes to actually getting a handle on this commercial vendor problem. I think the second thing is coming together when it comes to democracies, pushing each other either on an export controls basis or frankly having candid conversations with countries like Israel, which have a very strong private sector component that exports these products, or using the Summit for Democracies as a point of leverage in which to actually push real rules and to close off loopholes when it comes to the procurement and the export of these products. I think those two kind of broad principles can go a long way.
Congressman Himes?
I agree with everything said. The only thing I would add to the conversation is that we don't do, from a functional standpoint, we don't do nearly the job we need to do in creating the back and forth between the government and the private sector that we ultimately need to get to. And if you open the aperture beyond just spyware to a more general cybersecurity universe, Colonial Pipelines was instructive. The federal government knew almost nothing in real time about what was happening there. And there's all sorts of good reasons why this is a hard problem, right? Companies are rightly concerned with giving personally identifiable information to the government. There are questions about things like, is paying ransom legal? Is it illegal? So there are a lot of hard problems to solve, but I do know that if we don't do a better job over time, generally speaking in cybersecurity, being very clear about what essential infrastructure is, what the obligations of the private sector are, what the protections from liability are. If we don't continue to do that hard work, we're going to be fighting this fight with one hand behind our back. So I think we've made a little progress, but we have a very long way to go to create the kind of partnership that I think we need to have the right defenses in this world.
Congressman Himes, to follow up on that, we have an interesting question from Jack on this question about role of private sector. He asked, in cases where the private sector discovers commercial spyware infrastructure operated by adversarial actors, should they degrade or destroy it on the spot if they can, or should they be waiting for the FBI or another government agency?
When they discover commercial spyware, I wouldn't put an or between that, right? They ought to obviously do whatever they need to do to secure their customers' systems or to alert people, and then they should also share it with law enforcement, assuming laws were broken. If it's not a purely criminal operation and there's some question about nation-state involvement, I would hope that they would let the. So I really don't think it's an or. I think companies need to protect their customers, and they also need to interact with both law enforcement and, where appropriate, intelligence community people.
Yeah, probably similar to, as you were saying, with Colonial Pipeline and figuring out those roles for private sector and public sector and when to respond and to share information. If either of you have any thoughts on this question too, feel free to jump in. Nope? Okay. Well, I have one more question for the three of you, and then I do want to open it up for our in-person audience if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask in the last 10 minutes that we have with our panel. Congressman Himes, you had mentioned before about the need to think about investments, and we're thinking about that from the private sector perspective, also recognizing that venture capital community as well and the types of investments that they're making into a lot of these technologies. Steve, I'd like to go to you first with this question, but how do you think that we should be engaging the venture capital community that might be making some of these investments And maybe even broadly, just the commercial sector writ large, as they're thinking about investing into their technologies to make sure that they're doing it responsibly?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And actually, there has been, I think, a lot of progress on this front in the sense that a lot of members in the digital rights community have identified entities like Francisco Partners, Novo Pina Capital, both of which have been investors in a variety of different spyware companies and have written letters, have advocated and pushed for them to divest their support from these companies. And so I think that ought to be something that is included much more explicitly, using a host of measures. It could be through ESG indicators, otherwise, but to really kind of elevate that to the forefront and say it's no longer good enough to sort of disclaim any prior knowledge about what your underlying investments are actually doing, what their behavior actually is. You have a duty and a responsibility of care when it comes to the money and support you're giving in. I think that is a really important principle, and frankly, I would open up even strategic litigation and a right of action for those who have been harmed that would extend both to the companies themselves, but even to some of the underlying investors in them as a way to sort of promote greater accountability and frankly to cut off resources to those entities that are operating in an irresponsible way.
Christopher, do you have anything to add on this?
Yes, and in keeping with my prior answers, it'll be large and abstract, and I'll try to only say controversial things. It reminds me a lot of the traditional national security problem from the government in this area, which is if a foreign power hacks and steals your hotel records or health records or whatever, is that a national security incident? No. Well, what if they hack 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000? At some point it just becomes 0 times a million, and you go, well, we don't care because that's not a defense system or something. That's a traditional view. I'm not saying that's the way it is now, but for a long time that's how it was. That's obviously wrong when they're doing it specifically to gain influence over or negatively affect the United States or its people, and it's a foreign military or intelligence agency doing it. So why do they care about doing it and we don't care about stopping it as a national security issue? There's some mismatch there. I think you're going to find that, because you asked a venture capital-centric question, I think you're going to find you have this similar issue in the private sector. So at Google, we already do a lot of this for our users. The same experts who defend Google itself or candidates for office and so forth, you can sign up for the Advanced Protection Program yourself. A lot of journalists do, but anybody can sign up for it. It's the same people in the same systems, defending you. But we were already very large and profitable when we rolled that out. So how does a new company capture economic benefit from defending individuals? They're sort of creating something that's for the common good. And I don't actually have an answer for you, but I think I imagine there's some role where the government or perhaps other investment incentives have to be created where if you're defending individuals as individuals and you're creating a certain amount of value from ensuring their privacy, how do you capture that for society at large? That has been in the past a problem for the national security community. It still is, I think, in the private sector where a lot of the investments that are made are to defend corporations or government. You have to have a certain economy of scale to benefit from it. How do we capture that for the average citizen in our countries? So I've described the problem in a different way. I don't have any solutions for you. But as I said, I'm a threat analyst just because,
Yeah.
I'll also point out there are people at Google who are working on those solutions. Google Jigsaw obviously is trying to come up with novel technological solutions to help people. But again, how do you incentivize new investments by new companies? I don't have an answer for you. I hope maybe somebody else does, and I can learn from that.
Congressman Himes, any final
Yeah, I really
thoughts
don't have
on
much to
this?
add. I thought Steve gave a very sophisticated answer to the question. The one thing I might add, and this is sort of strange coming from the government representative here, industries and corporations have different cultures and care more or less about cultures and ethics. And I do think, in addition to everything that Steve outlined, there's a venture capital ecosystem, right? Venture capitalists care whether they co-invest with each other. They make judgments about who do we want on the cap table and everything. And again, it's not the government guy's role to say this, but my hope would be that there would be leaders in that industry trying to suffuse the venture capital industry with a sense of values, a sense of very positive culture, and that would propagate. It'll never be perfect. There will always be rogues and outliers, but there's a difference between an anarchic, nothing but profit-centric culture and one that tries to act according to a set of values and ethics.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to open it up for the in-person audience. If you have any questions, just raise your hand, and then we'll make sure that the mic gets to you so that our online audience can hear you as well. Yes, in the front.
Hi, Tim Starks from the Washington Post. I wanted to ask you about the letter that you mentioned from the administration. You said there was a section where they talked about prohibition of this kind of technology, but there was some verbiage that was caveat-laden or perhaps conditional. What do you think? What do you think a ban should look like? And I, of course, welcome the others if they wanted to say something on that as well. Do you just chop off the end of the sentence? Is it that easy?
Yeah, no, I'm referring to it because I literally read it on the way over here. It just landed in our inboxes. But I'll read it again. An executive order to prohibit U.S. government operational use of commercial spyware that poses counterintelligence or security risks to the United States or risks of being used, of being used improperly. So what I read there, and again, you're getting it an hour after I did, what I read there is that generally speaking, we want to come down hard on this stuff, but we want to leave some doors open for something and somebody. So again, I don't want to try to give you what they mean by this, because you should ask them that, but what they're very clearly not saying is that there should be an operational ban on the part of the U.S. government with respect to any of this technology.
But do you think that it should just in the sentence earlier there, is there a way to have a ban that you would like?
So I think I talked about this a little bit in the previous fireside chat. So maybe just reiterate the way I feel about it, and it's just me. Again, I think I said that it would be negligent for a group like the FBI not to acquire technology or investigate, from a research and development and counterintelligence standpoint. I want them looking at whatever technology is out there. With respect to operational use, I'll say something obvious, which is, somebody like me would be absolutely concerned that use was, consistent with privacy protections and Fourth Amendment and all that good stuff. But I'm not going to blanket, again, we talked about this before. I'm not going to say that, prima facie, there's a tool that will simply not ever be used by the United States government. I'm much more interested in what the protocols and governance of that use are.
Any other audience questions? Well, I have another one for the group then. So we talked a lot about the public-private sector collaboration. We talked about what Congress is doing. I'm curious to hear from all of you how we think that the executive branch and Congress can work better together on these issues. Congressman Himes, I might start with you, and then we might go down the row to see if any of you have any thoughts. Recognizing that we also, they have been responsive too from the executive branch level, but anything else, I guess, that you would like to see, or ways that you think they could work better together?
It's hard to give you a blanket answer to that question, because I can think of examples where we've worked superbly together, and then I can think of examples where the Congress felt ambushed about something, and it doesn't necessarily correlate with party. The last 6 years, this is a hard question for me to answer. The last, in particular, the previous administration, the entire oversight apparatus got turned over to the question of Russian interference in our election, and oh my gosh, what happened on the call with Ukraine, and so we sort of stopped doing traditional oversight. I guess the only smart thing I can say is not that smart, which is, number one, as a matter of balance of power, the administration must keep us in the loop at a greater detail than they do naturally. And number two, constitutional or balance of power issues aside, we would be really foolish not to dedicate ourselves to that partnership, because the capabilities of the executive are mind-boggling. I mean, on HPSI and CISI, the capabilities are mind-boggling, and it's really important that the Congress understand what those are for all kinds of reasons. So that's not a smart answer, but those are the principles by which I would try to answer it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Steve and Christopher, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. What I would say is I think Congress traditionally has played a really important role in holding the executive branch accountable. Before I was in this job at Carnegie Endowment, I was the Frank and Bethune Church Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University for 3 years. And Frank Church is someone who, was responsible for implementing it or passing FISA and exposing abuses in the executive branch. And I think that type of work needs to continue, and that vigilance and that check on power is exceptionally important. So the great work that Congressman Himes is doing in terms of pushing the administration on these questions and getting correspondence back, holding hearings and so forth, I think is really essential. One other small point I wanted to make regarding Tim's last question, which is that I actually get where the administration is coming from, and I think most people in the digital rights community would agree with that in the sense that there is a standard out there that says this is when you can use these tools. It's exceptional, it's very rare, but it's based on necessity, proportionality, lawfulness, and legitimacy. And so probably that little carve-out that is in the letter relates to that standard in the sense that if you walk through this four-part standard and you somehow make it out into the other end, and you actually meet all the criteria in an objective way, then that does give you a narrow carve-out, whether it's counterterrorism or other kind of imminent national security problems, to partake of these types of technologies. So just a small point.
Yeah, no, thank you. Christopher?
Yeah,
Any last
absolutely.
thoughts?
Sort of briefly, two last thoughts. One is I agree with what Steve just said, and the solution is to make these systems as well defended as possible, and then if you need to, buy NSA more supercomputers or something like that, right? That's General Hayden's traditional solution. I guess that's the camp that I personally fall, into on those issues. What do we do about this problem broadly? I mean, I think we've all in the panel talked about it today, but making sure that we agree that it's important, making sure that it's available when our countries need it. I don't really have much to add beyond that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think we have time for one more question. I'll scan the audience again if anyone has any questions. And if not, I have one more from online, which I will ask, and that will be our last question to wrap us up. So I will go to you, Christopher, first for this one. So TikTok may not have been created to be spyware, but it exposes millions of American users to similar exploits with the added complication that users install the vulnerabilities themselves. How, if at all, do apps like TikTok fit into this conversation?
I think I'll probably defer to Steve
Yeah.
or the Congressman on the question.
I'm not wasn't quite ready for the TikTok question, though that seems to come up a lot. I'll just say something very briefly, which is that I think there are legitimate concerns about TikTok's operation here, and one thing in particular that really bothers me is the fact that TikTok benefits from the market of the United States and all the rule of law protections and so forth that allows that market to thrive. It gains immense profits from that as a result, and yet overseas it feels that it doesn't need to adhere to any kind of rule of law standards or democratic standards. Look at what TikTok's doing in Russia. It censors any kind of information about the war coming from any sort of source, whether it's internal or external. And so how can that discrepancy be allowed to exist? How can TikTok both benefit from the profits and revenues of the United States, and yet, on the other hand, egregiously flout human rights and democracy principles worldwide? To me, that's just one of many concerns, I think, that are legitimate when it comes to TikTok.
Congressman Himes, do you have anything to add to that?
Just one small thing, which hasn't come up, but should come up whenever we talk about cybersecurity generally. We do need to do a much better job at propagating in the general public transparency about what's happening here. I don't know what percentage of the American public would know the history of TikTok, who owns it, that kind of stuff. I would expand the conversation to say far more people need to understand the psychophysiological effects of the algorithms on the social media platforms, and why they get addicted to these things. Far more people need to do two-factor authentication. I say all this stuff in service of saying we've never really been systematic and deliberate about teaching the American public the things that they need to know so that they can make far more informed decisions than they make today.
Well, please give a big round of applause to all three of our panelists, Congressman Himes, Steve Feldstein, and Christopher Porter. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise. Thank you all for joining us online and for submitting your questions, and thank you to our in-person audience for joining us for this discussion on spyware and security. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Good morning. Welcome to today's event on renewing American industrial policy. My name is Martin Rasser, Senior Fellow and Director of the Technology and National Security Program here at